First, can I welcome you all? This is part of a whole sequence of faculty events that touch each of the areas: sport, psychology, health, social work and allied health activities, and education, that we put on through the academic year. And for my sins, I help coordinate it. That means everything that goes wrong is my fault. And everything that's good, it obviously comes from the different bits of the faculty, as it were. So that's by way of explaining what tonight's about. And the main purpose of this evening is to listen to Jay Derrick, who is Director of Post-Compulsory Teacher Education at the Institute of Education. It's one of only 2 institutions that has outstanding across all of its work, and especially for its work in post-compulsory education. I once went and interviewed, had a conversation with the head of the Institute of Education just before it became part of the UCL, and his description of how wonderful the institution was began with Jay as the head of the Director of Post-Compulsory Education. And he runs the ETF project to Teach 2 there. I wasn't entirely convinced by Chris about Jay, because I've worked with him for 40 years in one form or another. And I do know how much he enjoys pleasure as well as serious academic work. So I thought he was well qualified to come and talk to us. And it says on the blurb we put out that he worked for many years in adult, further and vocational education and training. I think the most exciting bit was when he went off to the Seychelles to organise the Socialist Republic of Seychelles youth education programme. But apart from that...
For which I take no responsibility.
No, that's right. But it was still quite an exciting thing to do, and it worked in adult literacy work and in FE more broadly. I won't go on, I'll let him introduce himself. So I have to say, I gave him his first job. So that's why I thought it would be really nice to invite him along, since he's such an expert in our field. And I hope that's a really sober and well-behaved introduction. Over to you, Jay.
Thank you all very much. Thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I'm very flattered about it, actually, because I don't do this sort of thing very often. I'm not actually particularly comfortable in the sort of lecture format. I'll just say I'm particularly pleased, as part of my training, I'm particularly pleased to come to Wolverhampton. We've got our teacher education work at the Institute of Education in London has pretty good links with Wolverhampton at the moment. I don't think we have had over the years, obviously there's a distance, isn't there? But at the moment, Julie Hughes, who works here, is one of our external examiners, and she's been great.
And she had a grandchild at 4 this morning, or she'd be here.
Oh, exciting. Right, so, and of course now, the stronger link for me personally is that Alan is here, and Peter Lavender too, who I've known very well for a long time, worked with for ages. So, and John Traxler too, who also, the 3 of us all worked together in Brighton in the 70s. So this is a bit weird actually. John and I haven't seen each other for a very long time. This is lovely anyway. So anyway, I hope this is going to be worth it. I'm going to start by telling a story about, about Bob Dylan. I work in post-compulsory education. That's a horrible word for it. Adult further education. I started in adult and then, without planning to, as it's always this way, ended up being part of a further education college in London after the abolition of the IMEA, and then through all sorts of strange pathways came into HE. But it all started because of Bob Dylan, and this is not entirely a joke. When I was doing my finals, I went to Sussex University, and during the term I was doing my finals, one of my friends came along and said, "I've discovered this course about Bob Dylan at the local adult education centre. You've got to come." He said, "The guy who runs it is really interesting." Who's doing the teacher is really interesting. So I went along, and it was Alan, and he was the relatively newly appointed head of the local adult education centre. And this was an adult education course about Bob Dylan, poetry and music and everything, and it broke all the rules of adult education, and the rules that still apply, which is that the numbers that start in a class always go down as the term goes on. This one broke the rules because the numbers actually went up. And I remember, it was an amazingly interesting range of people who came to it for all sorts of really strange and different reasons, including somebody who walked out of Bob Dylan's concert, one of Bob Dylan's concerts years before, because he was a folkie and didn't approve of Dylan going electric.
That and, said Judas.
Yeah, I think he walked out of that concert, yeah. So anyway, as a result of Bob Dylan, I met Alex.
So we'll go now.
That's just, so we do go back around. It's a bit of a tribute to you, Alan, because we've got on very well and we've done a lot of fun work together. Now listen, to serious stuff. I've been thinking about assessment as a practice. Since then, in a way, although I wouldn't say I was so conscious in those days, and assessment systems in particular since 2003, when Alan here and Peter, who worked for NIAS at the time, asked me to write something about assessment in adult literacy, language and numeracy. And it was published as part of a book called Testing 1, 2, 3, described, and I can't resist telling you this, by Alison Wolfe no less, as someone she would select for a politician's bedside reading. It was eccentric. Peter Lavender's piece was about ptarmigan. I'm not joking. Barry Brooks's, who used to run the Skills for Life programme, his had a Gauguin quotation in French as its title. And mine was relatively boring. It just said that compulsory testing of basic skills students was doing no one except statisticians any good. Soon after this, I was recruited by the National Research and Development Centre for Adult Literacy and Numeracy, which was at the Institute of Education in London, to contribute to a research project called Improving Formative Assessment, led by Katherine Eggleton, who's now at Sheffield University, and carried out field work and analysis and report writing, interviewed a lot of students about assessment, basic education students. And that was, both those two things, those two projects were really formative for me. Nowadays, still thinking about it a lot, not in quite so systematic a way, in relation to my work as a teacher educator and through talks with all my colleagues, both in the Institute and elsewhere. Now, today's talk is not going to be systematic in any way, and it's certainly not going to be original. It's just really me riffing about something I'm interested in. In case you're in a hurry and have come to get a straight answer to the question, should assessment be loan accepted? The answer is, it depends, or maybe hardly ever, or perhaps 42. I'm not by nature comfortable as a formal lecturer, as I said, so I intend to say this fairly quickly. I'm really good at speaking fast, I'm sorry about that. But I intend to get through this quickly and then we'll have time for talk. Okay, that's what I'd like. But do interrupt and ask questions during the meantime if you feel like it. I'd much rather it was informal. Okay, this is my starting point. Anyone recognise this? These people? You'll all be aware of the present craze for Scandinavian crime dramas on television. This is my favourite of the latest crop. It's a series called Arndal. And these are the main characters. It's a disparate team of police specialists put together to deal with complicated and serious crimes. This genre is very interesting, I think. The key features of it are, as I see it, they are state employees, that's really important. They work within shifting and sometimes hidden, even obscure, political and procedural frameworks. Team working and leadership issues are erased explicitly in all sorts of complex ways. The individuals are presented as juggling their professional and private lives, and often these overlap, although they don't really want them to. And they're presented as ordinary people, basically good people, who make mistakes from time to time, but are basically trying to do a good job. And a key question today, in relation to them, is, what would it mean to say that their work should be citizen-centred? That's why I justify putting them up there. And the question hints at why I've started by referencing Nordic Noir. Have you heard that phrase, Nordic Noir? It's great, yeah. These two are, I'm not even going to try to pronounce their names, I'm afraid, but they are pioneers of the Nordic Noir genre, as I understand it, I believe. They started writing novels in the 60s. They wrote 10 novels between them about a character called Martin Beck. I'm halfway through reading the first one of them. I never came across them until recently. They're pioneers of the Nordic Noir novel. They were communists, and they deliberately made use of neutral, understated police procedural narratives, which you can see even in the latest Scandinavian stuff on telly. It's neutral and understated, that's really important. And they did this deliberately and purposefully. They had a plan, and the quote, they did it for this reason, quote, as a scalpel cutting open the belly of the ideological, pauperised and morally debatable so-called welfare state of the bourgeois type. I think that's great, and that's why we've got to do the same thing in relation to education. They suggest that using the framework of everyday procedures that guide state employees as a lens for understanding the underlying structures and power relations of society. This is brilliant. This modus operandi for novelists or filmmakers or whatever seems to me to have methodological echoes of both Gramsci in the sense of problematizing common sense and Foucault, procedures as mechanisms of power. I'm not sure, well, of course, they might have known about Gramsci, they probably didn't know about Foucault, I don't know, but they just wanted to reveal what they saw as hidden power relations. Now, oh yeah, sorry, this is an illustrated talk. That's Gramsci and this is Foucault. So let's look at one of the everyday procedural aspects for teachers, of the work of teachers, the requirement that everything they do should be learner-centred. It's probably not, I don't know whether, it's not true to say it's explicit requirement, it's a kind of implicit one, or it's a kind of generally accepted one. It's in the culture rather than, occasionally procedures will say learner-centred. I should think Ofsted guidelines probably talk about learner-centred. It's one of those terms that is vague. There's loads of them in Britain. I don't know if it's the same in other languages. It's vague, it's unspecific, it's reassuringly warm, it feels right, it's definitely difficult to object to. Raymond Williams wrote about community as a word like that. It hides a multitude of sins. It's attached to all the main elements of teaching, learning and assessment. If you read any document, you'll find it. I've just been at the AOC conference this morning. I should think virtually everything you pick up is full of references to learner-centeredness. It's learner-centered curriculum, learner-centered colleges, learner-centered assessment, learner-centered universities. But what does it actually mean? What I think is that it allows the complex processes of learning to be apprehended as straightforward. And it's duplicitous in that way. It's misleading. It effectively forces a choice without you being aware of it in a way, to choose between teacher-centred, whatever that is, meaning which is all bad of course, and learner-centred, which is wholly good. It deletes the dynamic complexities of a teacher-student relationship. It simplifies that down to one, and of learning processes generally, and that's the problem. It's a bit like this. It's one of those phrases, which later became, of course, it later became 4 legs good, 2 legs better at the end of the book. The gap between this simplistic model of teaching and learning and reality creates space for similar narratives, and I mean similar narratives to, say, Animal Farm, or indeed the Nordic Noir. Perhaps not so dramatic as the Nordic Noir, I have to admit. It's not generally about life and death with us, is it, in education? But with the same potential to reveal underlying social and political relations. It's absolutely critical, therefore, that such innocent-looking mantras are problematised by educators. And this isn't just a job for professors at all, it's a job for everybody. And in as forensic a manner as possible, inspired by Martin Beck, Kurt Wallander, Armdahl people, Arndal is actually odd because it's the name of the series, but it's also the name of the novelist, rather than any of the characters in it. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know how that works. Anyway, so yeah, what we're doing then is deciding who the villain is, where they did it, and what they did it with. And that's what those novelists were trying to do as well, I think. Yeah. So here are some questions for a forensic examination of learner-centred, I suggest. In what ways is this lecture learner-centred? Is it learner-centred to tell students their work hasn't been good enough? How can learner-centred be reconciled with inspirational role modelling? In what ways is, say, the A-level politics curriculum learner-centred? Don't ask me which one, because I know it's changing almost every time you look. Apparently feminism has been taken out of it. I heard the other day, along with anarchism.
Okay, interesting.
Is exclusion ever a learner-centred action? In what ways is the inspection system learner-centred?
Yeah. Sorry.
And does being learner-centred mean different things for different learners? All of these things, at the very least, they suggest it's a term that should be used with care. Each in its way demonstrates the vagueness and superficiality of the term. The best person I know, I wanted to show a picture of somebody who's also an important inspiration for me on this issue. Best person I know asking subversive questions of this sort is Katherine Eggleton, who I worked with for a while, and who's somebody who's thought about this as much as anybody. I really recommend anything she's read. She's written about this. The book on autonomy she wrote on using a study of GMVQ students about probably 10 years ago now. It's really excellent. And of course she's actually better known now for this book argues that the whole education system is little more than therapeutic now. It's not about teaching anybody anything important. And I don't entirely agree with how far she'd go down that line, but I do think it's a really important thing to get argued about and think about. So what these questions do is to call into question, sorry, that's a bit clumsy, some of the most basic assumptions upon which our education arrangements are built. Now I'm going to miss that bit. We've done enough. I'm going to hurry on. You're going to get what I do is characterise the education system we have at present as technocratic. It's a horrible word, but it actually sums up for me what it seems to be the critical character of it. This means that it assumes that there's a purely technical solution to every educational problem. And I don't think this is a good basis on which to build education systems. And what I hope to do is to start demonstrating to you, because it's what my grounds are for thinking that. I'm not the only one who agrees with me on this. Dickens. I've got a lovely quote from Dickens. I'm sorry it's a bit long, but it's just fantastic. Mr. Macocomchild began in his best manner. He and some 140 other schoolmasters had lately been turned at the same time in the same factory on the same principles, like so many pianoforte legs. Actually, that you could do just with that sentence. He'd been turned out from a factory turning out teachers. This is Dickens in 1854, and there's a sense in which this is still the situation we've got. At least that's the situation the system would like us to have. Hard Times, if you're an educator, Hard Times is a really great book to read. It asks all those, it's a great example of a series of questions that are asked about education systems. Paolo Freire developed this more than most people. And I know you two will be very familiar with this. Because we all discovered this in the 70s. So, very crudely and sort of bluntly, he's famous for what he called the banking theory of learning, which is, I'll spend a bit of time on this. Knowledge and curriculum is abstract, given, standardised, levelled, that's important. Knowledge isn't of itself levelled, and I mean in terms of NVQ levels, yeah? But it is levelled and increasingly branded nowadays. The purpose of learning is only admission to the next level. There's nothing else is taken account of. Model of learning is generally transmission. The assumption is that teachers' job is simply to send that stuff into the heads of our students. Teachers are more or less mindless purveyors of knowledge. They have no input to make. Somebody said the other day on Twitter, where's the teacher's voice? Well, the system doesn't need a teacher's voice. It just needs teachers to give people the information. They're not meant to add anything. Teacher expertise consists of knowledge of the latest techniques, mostly uninformed by research, no requirement for reflective practice, and the things like, I hope I'm not offending anyone here, learning styles, mindfulness, whatever. I mean, it's just, there's one thing after another. You find a lot about it on Twitter. And I'm not saying it's all bad either. It's probably better than nothing at all. But the point is, it's basically one thing following another. There's no real sense of the complexity of teacher expertise is so much more than technique. So much more. And then assessment, testing, scoring, grading, objective, benchmarking, league tables, competition. All of which is fine if you for a model, but it's not reality. And this is a problem we have because basically a lot of us have bought this whole model and treat it as true. You know, if someone gets a GCSE C, that's the kind of person they are. And it will be for the rest of their life, unless they manage to get a B at some resit. Those things are seen as objective truth, and they're not. And actually, what's encouraging to me is that so many young people and parents are beginning to start asking for remarks. I once went to a lecture by Dylan William, who was at the Institute of Education, who's a big expert on all these things, and he showed how easy it is to prove mathematically that like 15% of all the results at GCSE are in the wrong grade. That's inevitable because, of course, they're not precise. And around the grade boundaries, there are going to be a reasonable number on the wrong side in each case. Some of them will be on the high side, and some of them will be on the low side. But it's at least 15-20%. If the public understood that, you get all hell would break loose, wouldn't it? And learners, of course, to come to the important point here, are seen as empty vessels. They're seen as passive consumers, customers, etc. So that's Paulo Freire in a nutshell, which is a real insult to him. Donald Shern, I'm a big fan of his, writing 30 years ago. I really like this quote. He's talking about all professional practice. His main subject is architects, in fact, but it applies. He means it to apply to all professionals. In the very topography of professional practice, there's high hard ground. This is a metaphor where practitioners make effective use of research-based theory. There's a swampy lowland where the situations are confusing messes, incapable of technical solution. And he also suggests that the high ground problems, the ones that can be solved by just obeying the procedures, sorting of the procedures, are actually not very interesting and not actually very important. The important ones are the complicated ones. Social workers making the judgment about whether to remove a child from their parents. You can't possibly reduce that to rules. You have to reduce it. You have to rely on the expertise of that and the goodwill of that social worker. And yet, and I would suggest teaching is like that. It's not life and death and everything, but the decisions that teachers make are those kinds of decisions all the time, almost all the time. And so we need to see them as swampy rather than hard ground problems in Donald Shern's view. And of course he followed it up with ideas about how to train these people. How do you train people for this kind of work as opposed to the high hard ground? How do you get people to increase their expertise so that their judgments are likely to be better? Because the thing about the swampy problems is that you actually never know whether you've made, there's certainly no such thing as the correct solution. It's certainly no way you could ever prove that it was the correct solution. You just don't know. You just have to do your best and hope for the best. And that's the case with teachers too, unless you think that the exam results are all that count. Finally, in this gallery, Ken Robinson, who's got one of the most successful watched TED talks on the internet, and it's really good. He's got two, I know. It's so annoying. I bet he's got a lot of Twitter followers as well. he's really good, and he's such a brilliant presenter, and he says this. He says loads of other wonderful things, like our education system assumes that the top achievement you could possibly have is to be a university professor. And what they are is basically just, they're the bodies of university professors, and we're talking Alan and John here, as far as I know, the only professors in the room, I don't know.
No,
Shout some more, I'm sorry. He says that if you...
I thought you were about to say he's clearly wrong.
He's a dancer, he's into dancing and performance, and his point is generally about creative work. And he makes this lovely thing about how, university professors, they do tend to be a bit cerebral, and it's as if their bodies have no other function but to move their heads from one meeting to another. It's very nice. Sorry, I don't know as much. So he's also saying there's a problem with technocratic education, and it makes some students feel this wasn't for them, and it actually stigmatises what they're good at. And he's particularly thinking about dancing and performing arts. This is just a picture, don't bother trying to read this. This is a study that I found really important about how assessment affects learners. Different modes of assessment affect learners differently. And it, political emphasis on, you don't need to read the clarity of assessment criteria. We know, when I started working in education, certainly in adult education, when I did my A-levels, it was completely undreamt of that you'd know what the assessment criteria were. You just had to work as hard as you could and hope for the best, didn't you? The idea of giving learners the view of the assessment criteria came in between now and then, so in the 70s, I guess. I believe it started in adult education, I think something like the Open College Network. The sense that adult learners should be trusted. They needed control of the learning process, and one way to do that was to tell them how they were going to be assessed. Doesn't seem unreasonable at all, does it? It's a learner-centred policy. Yeah? The problem is, as this study found, that clarity of assessment criteria supports achievement and progression, absolutely, as far as it's measured. Yeah? But transparency encourages instrumentalism, and we'll all be familiar with this. The students who only do as much as they need to pass to get onto the next level, and aren't interested much in the content either. We've all had this experience, and it's a problem that's grown and grown and grown. So the system is kind of turning into a vicious circle in this respect. And what they're beginning to say this, the most significant challenge confronting assessment in the learning and skills sector is balancing the explicitness of learning objectives and instruction processes against the validity and worthwhileness of learning outcomes. What's it all for? Because it's not turning out people who are better at work. They may have more exams, but they're not better at living in the real world. That's the suggestion, or they may not be. Now this kind of twist, this paradox, is an example, I think, I would suggest, of Goodhart's law. Anybody come across this? It's basically an economics law. It came originally from economics, but it's being used more and more in relation to education. It was come up with by this guy Goodhart, who's the one on the right. Any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. He worked for the Bank of England. So this is quite serious stuff. Dylan Williams...
The relationship between those two.
You know what I mean? I know, it was 1975, so it can't be blamed for the recession. But in fact, it may be that the recession was caused by this kind of problem. I mean, or aspects of it anyway, yeah. The guy on the left is Dylan Williams, who's a very interesting guy and an assiduous critic of technocratic education, although he's not against numbers, he's not against measurement, he's not against scientific research in education. But he says we should keep it in its proper place. The clearer you are about what you're trying to achieve, the more likely it is you will achieve it. However, it won't then be what you originally wanted it to be. And that's what happens. Everything becomes different when people start trying to achieve a particular target. I've paraphrased that a bit. So the argument so far is assessment is a key driver, perhaps the key driver of a technocratic education system. Learner-centred is an officially desirable feature of all educational activity, but in fact confuses as much as it clarifies. And the well-intentioned learner-centred push to make assessment criteria explicit has also encouraged the spread of instrumentalism. This may have increased measurable achievement and progression within the education system, but may also have diminished learning for real life and work. This leaves us with some difficult problems. Most significant problems, and these are assertions which I'm willing to argue about, and I'd like to argue about if any of you disagree strongly. Most significant problems, and including in education, are not well defined. So the knowledge and capacities needed to solve them, or just to address them, are not well defined. I mean, think global warming. Think ending the war in Syria. I mean, I'm not being over dramatic about this. What I'm doing, which is a bit unfair really, is saying what's this got to do with education. But I do think the problems that teachers face in a human sense, person to person, in an education classroom, are of the same level of complexity. They really are. They're kind of infinitely complex. Really. Quality work in education resists authentic measurement. It's easy enough to measure stuff, but is it authentic? How valuable, how true are those measurements? What works doesn't work. I mention this because governments, our last 2-3 governments, are obsessed with finding what works and making sure that every teacher does it, if they can. And they've funded millions of sort of, admittedly, short-term projects to find what works. We're just coming to the end of one from the Education and Training Foundation. It's been like this certainly since the turn of the century, I think probably before that. The idea is that there is a solution to the problem, say, of GCSE resits. There will be a solution to the problem of employers and apprenticeships, and so forth. And it's a matter of finding the right solution. Either it's in the classroom, or it's to do with local authorities, or it's to do with employers, or whatever. We'll find the solution and then apply it. Particularly strong, I have to say, under New Labour, who seem to me to be the archetypal technocratic government. And I was a big supporter of them. And they became more technocratic in their second term. To begin with, there was all sorts of signs that they were going to have a different approach. Does anyone remember the Learning Age? Of course. David Blockett's. Really visionary, and not about this, a different vision. But second term, it changed. And they spent lots of money, that's true, and that was very welcome. But it began to be metricated in a very strong way. The problem with what works as a question in education is that everything works somewhere and nothing works everywhere. It's not like science. That's the critical thing. It is not. George Bush is famous for saying once, we're going to change education. For too long it's been the subject of whim, and we're going to turn it into a science like agriculture. I'm not sure that agriculture is all that scientific. There's a lot of kind of trying things out and hoping for the best in agriculture, and certainly in gardening. My experience isn't to go back. But the point is, it's not like science. And classical science, you'll all be familiar, yeah? If you do the same experiment in Moscow or in Chicago, you get exactly the same results. And if you don't, it's your fault. You've done something wrong. Now, education is not like that. That's my proposition. Education can't be mechanised or reduced to rules. And then there's an interesting question for those of us who are teacher trainers. How do you train people for this? It's really complicated. It's certainly not a matter of learning information. So I want to move on to, as fast as I can, we're going to be this way. I want to discuss an alternative way of thinking about this, and to look at this from two perspectives. One from a wide angle and one from a narrow one. The first is to suggest that rather than technocratic transmission of non-negotiable packets of knowledge to gain certification, a better model for teaching and learning is generic craft practice. And I'm going to talk about craft and what I mean by that in a second. For the second perspective, I'll elaborate a more expansive and authentic model of feedback as an integral element of teaching and learning, compatible with the craft approach. And I'll end by coming back to learner-centeredness. So craft, I want to start by saying craft has a very bad pejorative even reputation in education circles. It sums up, well, one area of derogatoriness has been used by government ministers a number of times in this government, the last government, which is as a derogatory social category used to describe occupations unfit for gentlemen, as in the discourse of more than one government minister talking about teachers. For people who do useful work but are not professionals. Yeah? We want plumbers to do professional work, but we don't actually describe them as professional. As it's not a professional, area of work. All those kinds of things. I don't want to get into the discussion about what we mean by professionalism, but basically craft also sums up, of course. I mean, I'm exaggerating in a way, but the BBC or the television media will certainly, in craft, they think of Women's Institute. But yeah, baking and jam making and things like that. Maybe pottery. So it's got this kind of bad reputation, or not a good reputation, or a rather kind of bizarre one, and certainly not a serious one. And my thinking about this, the key thing for me about this, going into this area, is because of a realisation that the most significant professional learning of teachers is gained through their experience of the practical work of teaching, in classrooms and in workshops. That's where they learn their job. And hence that's like craft workers. Whether or not they've experienced a formal course of initial training is not the issue, really. And I'm not against formal training. So key influences on my thinking, if you want to follow any of this up, are Richard Sennett, who's written a book about The Craftsman, which is very, very interesting and rich, and I haven't got to the bottom of it yet, but he's a wonderful speaker if you ever get to see him, sociologist. Aristotle, who basically had all this clear in 300 BC. Absolutely. He had a theory of knowledge which has the stuff about that Schoen talks about, and we've forgotten it since the Enlightenment. Primo Levi's written a wonderful book about craft in relation to his writing, but also he's a chemist, but he compares his job as a writer to one of an engineer, and it's a series of stories about the engineer telling him stories about his work, and they're having a discussion about it, and I really recommend it. It's called The Wrench. And if you think about it in relation to teaching, it's really stimulating. And this is Diderot, the French encyclopedist, who also took craft really seriously, and is worth having a look at. So I want to play you a short video now, which illustrates some of the things I'm talking about.
These students at Newark College are training to be violin makers. Rose has started her very first instrument.
I was going to do music at university, and then I did work experience with violin making, and I suppose I preferred this side of the violin much more than playing it.
Jin Kong and Katherine Eggleton are more experienced.
We've been here 4 years, so and there's still so much more to learn. You never stop learning.
The students are making violins based on the Stradivarius. Now they're getting the opportunity to see and hear a real one. Paul Barrett is leader of the Halley Orchestra, and he's come to the college to give a workshop.
They can read up all about how it's made, they can see pictures of these violins, but to hear what it means to a player may, I hope, add something to their perceptions of what they're about to do with the violins for a living.
Everyone had the chance to see the Stradivarius up close, even the possible future player. For Paul Barrett, violins don't come any better than this.
So do these students have any hope one day of producing something close?
I've played wonderful modern violins, but age, I think, does do something to the sound production. What we're talking about here is projection of sound. There are many violins that will sound equally good, even modern ones, in a small room as this. It's when you get to the concert hall that you notice the difference.
Paul's Stradivarius was made in 1695, so today's students may have to wait over 300 years to see if theirs measure up. Peter Snow, East Midlands Today, in Newark.
So that thing was made by someone 320 years ago in Italy. But I think, it's The 300, the 1695 is just really mind-blowing, isn't it? But that illustrates a really important point that I'm trying to make, I think, about craft. There's something, one of the real features of craft practice is the importance of time. This clip illustrates many of the themes, but time I'll say a little bit more about in a second. So, I hope this is going to work. Yes. So I'm trying to encapsulate what I think is important about the craft metaphor, and many of this is illustrated in that video. Mastery is only developed, I apologise for the word, mastery is developed only through practice over time. You do not get good at things quickly. Especially if it's those kinds of things that are swampy. Expertise to deal with swampy problems is not something you can acquire quickly. Development and improvement is generally through collaboration. You don't do it on your own either. It could be, reflection is important, but it's better done with others. Judgment, it's about judgment, and decisions are taken for better or worse, because the context is that you can never really know. You hope for the best. And this is the same thing with teachers and social workers. There's a lot of trial and error, learning through mistakes. You have to value learning through mistakes. You have to be willing to make mistakes. You have to be prepared to jump off that cliff, etc. It's like, I haven't said anything here about the metaphor of musicians and jazz and things like that, but actually it's very attractive. And I know, as a very bad musician myself, the idea of jumping off and becoming an improviser, doing the jazz solo, it's impossibly scary. It's much easier to learn in a very kind of pedestrian way to play the right chords and to play at the right place. What we're talking about, teachers, if they learn like that, would never be good teachers. They wouldn't respond well to students. So that's what that kind of thing I'm talking about. Sensitivity to materials, local distinctiveness. Now what that's important about is that the materials for teachers are students. What they're doing, they're not carving wood or making pots out of clay. They are, in a sense, they're making their students. And of course they're not completely making them, but they are shaping them, for better or worse. Yeah? They're not the only people shaping them, but they are potentially very big and very important in the shaping of those people. And so in a sense, they're the materials. The other really important point about the craft metaphor, as opposed to a technocratic view, is that every product is unique. The point of the system is not to produce identical outputs. That's the manufacturing metaphor that Ken Robinson's so articulate about. The manufacturing idea should not be applied to the core business of teaching and learning. I'm not saying bits of it couldn't be manufactured. If you've got to have tests, then you might as well have them done automatically online and stuff like that. But in terms of the relationship between teachers and students, it's important that it's not about producing the same outcomes. And there should be continual striving for excellence, an absolute contempt for shoddiness, which is a lovely phrase from the potter Edmund de Waal. He's really articulate about the value of craft as a moral practice. So continual striving for excellence, but the idea of perfection is meaningless. It's completely meaningless, and the idea of getting things completely wrong is meaningless too. And it's actually damaging to think about perfection. So actually, there's a sense in which, and I believe this, perfectionists are not going to make good teachers, mostly. So what we want from people is consistency of purpose and effort. Consistency is fine if it's about effort and the effort to get better and to do your best, but not of outcome. Outcomes need to be different, need to be allowed to be different. And it's really important, the moral content of practice. Now, not all crafts people talk about that, but a lot of them do. It makes you a better person doing it, and you are producing goods, in the Aristotelian sense, goods, for the community. Aristotle would have said the polis, the city, but for the community, basically. And it's not good, it's not moral in the sense of religious in the slightest. It's what's good for the community, good for the society we're in. He uses the word virtue in that way. Okay, lighten up a bit, Jay. Your feedback is important to us. I hope it's good.
Okay.
That's the whole thing we read there.
Yes.
Okay, that's partly a joke, but that's two kinds of feedback. Does anyone recognise the first bit of feedback? Alan or John?
It's Metal Machine music.
It isn't Metal Machine music, no. There was this dreadful record around when we were working together by Lou Reed, which was just a whole album, old vinyl album, of feedback, of guitar feedback like that. That's a little bit the end of a canned heat song. And it's, I thought this was a very funny cartoon. It was in The Guardian only a couple of weeks ago. Quite amazing serendipity. Oh, that's the last bit. It isn't the last bit. That's a bit worrying. So the point is, to finish up, the craft metaphor, the practice of teaching produces people who are more skilled, knowledgeable and resilient. It also produces teachers who are more experienced practitioners, because by doing you learn in the craft vision. So people are the material that teachers as craft practitioners work on and with. And in that sense, they're at the centre of the process. They don't determine the process, but they participate in it. That's learners. They don't determine the process. They're not at the centre, but they participate. As if any of you know Laven Wenger's work about moving from the outside of the community of practice to the middle. The problem with Laven Wenger is the idea that learners never have anything to teach. And in practice, workplaces have learning and teaching going in all sorts of different directions. And their model doesn't quite fill that. But the point is then, it's nonsense to talk about learners as being at the centre. It's not politically incorrect to say that learners have something to learn, and that teachers have something to offer. So it's more complicated than that. Feedback. Communication between two or more people about the quality of work in any domain of practice. Its purpose is to lead to improvement of that work and to support improvement in the expertise of the practitioners involved, all of them. It will typically involve comparisons with similar work and refer to agreed standards of quality. It will typically result in specific actions to be taken intended by particular practitioners to improve their work and their continuing professional development. Feedback is a conversation which can take place over an extended time period. The purpose of feedback, the focus of feedback is a piece of work. Feedback is essentially constructive. Insights and provisional judgments of quality can flow in any direction. It doesn't always the teacher to the student, it could easily be the other way around. Feedback has to be authentic if it has any meaning at all. And if it's authentic, then it can't just be ritualised. That's really one of the things we found out in the improving formative assessment. Things like the praise sandwich, some of you may have heard of, where this was being bandied around in the Skills for Life sectors 10 years ago. Learners caught on to that so quickly. And then, of course, they don't believe anything you say, because you're clearly playing a role. So authenticity is absolutely critical if it's to make a difference. Feedback produces new understandings and insights for all participants, not just those designated learners. And sometimes, and this is the final point, sometimes those insights will be uncomfortable. If feedback can't be uncomfortable, if learning can't be uncomfortable, then it's not learning. So, to finish, should assessment be learner-centred? Well, I don't think it's a sensible question. I've said, depends, maybe, probably not. And I'll finish there. Thank you.